So for this week's World Heritage visit, I'm here at Blenheim Palace, the home of the Churchill family and the seat of the first Duke of Marlborough, the victor at the Battle of Blenheim. So the history of this palace is a long and interesting one, and it all starts off with this one man, John Churchill. Now, Sir John Churchill, later the first Duke of Marlborough, first Prince of Blenheim, first Count of Nellenberg, Prince of the Holy Roman Empire, Knight of the Garter, and part of Her Majesty's most honourable Privy Council, had a very interesting life. He was born in 1650, during a time known as the Interim, when England was very briefly a republic. And his career as a politician, a statesman, and a military leader was full of highs and lows. He would ultimately serve under 5 English monarchs, but his zenith came during the reign of Queen Anne, when he led the Grand Alliance armies during the War of the Spanish Succession. And the event that would really make him famous, well, that would be the Battle of Blenheim. Located in western Bavaria, Blenheim, or Blenheim in English, is a small village that in the summer of 1704 was the site of one of the most significant battles of the War of the Spanish Succession. Until this point, the French and Spanish armies had been largely victorious in Europe, and with French forces marching on Vienna, they threatened to kick both the Austrians and the Holy Roman Empire out of the war. Now, Marlborough's victory at Blenheim practically wiped out an entire French army and saved the Habsburgs' realm and prevented the Grand Alliance from crumbling. As recognition for his victory, the Crown gave the Marlboroughs the manor of Woodstock in Oxfordshire for the construction of a palace fitting such a national hero. But this is when all of the trouble started. His wife Sarah wanted Sir Christopher Wren. The Duke, however, wanted Sir John Vanbrugh. The Duke got his way, but this didn't make things any easier. Vanbrugh and the Duchess hated each other. Vanbrugh wanted an extravagant house built in a massive Baroque style. The Duchess hated the designs and wanted something simpler. Eventually it led to Vanbrugh storming off site in a rage in 1716. And then there was the cost. Although the royal reward had mentioned the land and the building of a house, there was no mention of the costs of funding it. Now, the Marlboroughs initially contributed £60,000, roughly £5 million in today's money, towards the cost of the house, with the state funding the rest. But in 1712, due to Sarah and Queen Anne having a massive falling out, Sir John was eventually dismissed as head of the army, and the pair of them ended up going to voluntary exile in Europe. And at this point, all the state funding for the house ceased. Now, this is Vanbrugh and the other workers being owed about £45,000, roughly the equivalent of about $4 million in today's money. Now, after the death of Queen Anne, the Marlboroughs did actually return to England, and the building resumed. Total cost of the construction was around about £300,000, roughly $25 million in today's money. However, dying in 1722, Sir John actually didn't live long enough to see the palace completed in all its glory. So I suppose it's time we actually had a proper tour of the place. So as you enter through the main front doors, you end up going into what is called the Grand Hall, and this absolutely stunning entrance hall to the building, and 20 metres above you is the ceiling painted by Sir James Thornhill, and he painted this in 1716, and it shows in a wonderful classical theme that was popular in the Baroque period as well as later. Sir John Churchill kneeling in front of Britannia with a picture of the plan for the Battle of Blenheim, a wonderful piece of artwork sort of glorifying the Duke and his achievements in the War of the Spanish Succession. The main door opposite the entrance does lead you to the Great Saloon, which we're going to get to at a later date. We're going to take the slightly long way route around and go down the corridors. So now the corridors are largely the work of Vanbrugh in his Baroque style, with these columns and wonderful arches, and in there you'll find wonderful little pieces that have been collected by the family over the years. You've got things like porcelain, actually Chinese porcelain, from the Kangxi period, the late 16th and early 1700s. You've got works of English and European porcelain. You've got a small collection of toy soldiers that have been used by the family over the years. And as you follow the corridors around, they take you to the first of a number of drawing rooms. Funny enough, referred to as the green drawing room because it's green. Who'd have thought it? Now, the green drawing room is the first of one of the rooms largely designed by one of the other architects, a man called Nicholas Hawksmoor. And he designed the ceiling for both this one and the red drawing room. And again, all in this wonderful English Baroque style that, I mean, the Baroque style was quite popular in Europe at the time, but what makes Blenheim particularly special is it really kind of exemplifies as the finest example of what became known as the English Baroque style of architecture. There is a picture in here of the 4th Duke of Marlborough, George Spencer, and he was actually the first Duke to live within the palace permanently as his permanent residence. And he was the one that's largely responsible for the design of the grounds as they currently are, but we'll get to the grounds later. As you go from the green drawing room, you move on to the red drawing room, and again you'll find displayed on the walls a lot of the portraits of the various dukes and their families. Pretty much every generation had the family portraits made of themselves. And as you move on through, the actual green writing room was closed for some refurbishment work on my visit, so we're going to jump straight ahead to the saloon. Now, the saloon has got this absolutely fantastic painting across all the walls and the ceiling. This was essentially just one giant, almost three-dimensional painting, really. Again, you've got this wonderful fresco on the ceiling that again depicts the first Duke of Marlborough, Sir John Churchill, in classical sort of Roman dress as the conquering hero, because you can never have too much aggrandizement. And this was painted by a French artist, Louis Leguerrier. And he was brought in because, yet again, Sarah, the Duke's wife, refused to pay the high amounts that the Duke's architects and artists had quoted her. So she eventually paid Leguerrier a sum of £500 to paint the ceiling, which works out to be about £42,000 today. Now, also along the walls, you've got, again, same style of artwork, absolutely gorgeous artwork, representing the four known continents at the time: the Americas, Europe, Africa, and Asia. And you also have the double-headed eagle to symbolise the title of Prince of the Holy Roman Empire that Sir John Churchill had been given after his victory at Blenheim. Now, this saloon actually reminds me a lot of some of the other Baroque saloons you've seen, some of the other palaces in Europe. One of the other ones I've been to, which I can also recommend visiting, is the Nymphenburg Palace in Munich, in Bavaria, and that has a similar wonderfully painted ceiling. Now, moving on from the saloon, we go in through a series of staterooms, the first, second and third staterooms, and the most notable feature of these are what's known as the Marlborough tapestries. These tapestries were commissioned for the first, second and third staterooms, as well as the green writing room, and these tapestries basically show the story of the Battle of Blenheim and the Duke's campaign. So it's wonderful. Although they're 300 years old, you've got these wonderful pieces of artwork. My pictures sadly didn't do them justice. But yeah, they tell the story of the siege, the various sieges and the build-up to the battle. And just a reminder again of the first Duke's achievements. Now, as you go through the third and final stateroom, you move into what's known as the Long Library. Now, the Long Library is thought to be the second longest room of any house in England, and it's how Vanbrugh wanted it to be, as a marble room of parade, or a picture gallery. It's 56 metres long and 10 metres high, and thought to contain around 10,000 volumes. Again, collection built up over the centuries from the various dukes and their families. Now, at the one end, there is, despite all their arguments and falling out, a statue that Sarah had commissioned of Queen Anne, because they were solid friends for a long time, despite the various disagreements that ultimately led to the Duke and Duchesses being exiled. Now, the organ at the end is a Willis organ, and that was installed actually considerably later. It's from 1891, and it was installed by the 8th Duke and his American wife Lily. As you move on from the Long Library, it takes you into the chapel. Now, the chapel wasn't quite finished when the first Duke, Sir John, died. It's in 1722. Now, he had originally wanted to be buried in the chapel in Blenheim Palace. However, again, because it wasn't finished in time, he was actually initially interred in Westminster Abbey. And when Sarah died in 1744, the Duke was exhumed and reinterred at the now completed chapel in Blenheim Palace, and that's where they reside together in death. And then there's the gardens. Now, originally the gardens were designed at the same time as the palace, and Henry Wise, the royal gardener for Queen Anne, inspired by the gardens at the Palace of Versailles, designed the first set. And he actually had some forethought and used potted trees, because he realised that Sir John actually was not likely to live long enough to really appreciate the gardens in all their glory. So by having more mature trees in potted plants, it gave Sir John a sort of real feel for what the gardens would ultimately look like. As mentioned earlier, it was the 4th Duke who is largely responsible for the layout of the gardens, and he hired what is arguably the most famous landscape gardener in English history, Lancelot Capability Brown, to create this wonderful, more natural looking landscape that we have for the larger grounds. Now, one of these arguably the central feature is a bridge that had originally been built by Vanbrugh to cross what was then the marshy floodplain of the Glyme River. But it was Brown in 1764 who decided to turn the area into this sort of faux natural lake. So you end up with this kind of what is supposed to be thought to be a natural scene, but it's actually entirely artificial. This bridge then ended up becoming this wonderful central feature to cross this absolutely stunning lake. Now, part of the genius of Capability Brown was his forethought and his realisation that the gardens are not just going to be what they look now, but also what they're going to look like in decades and even centuries into the future. And the Arboretum is an example of that. He planted a lot of these trees as saplings, obviously knowing that they would grow over the decades and centuries to add some extra majesty to this wonderful set of gardens. It was also Brown who turned the dam of the Glyme into what is now called the Grand Cascade. Now, to make the lake, there was a small dam already to help control the flooding of the river, but to make the lake, he enlarged that. Obviously, this allowed the lake to fill up, and he turned it into this wonderful artificial waterfall, one of the most magnificent and picturesque waterfalls in England. And as for the Great Park, this much larger area, it became very much a typical sort of deer park and sheep grazing area that was quite typical of the English landed gentry at the time. That they'd have their own deer park so they could do some hunting, or they'd have the sheep wandering around the areas where they could make money from the wool, but also kind of, again, add to this kind of picturesque ideal of what a typical English landscape is supposed to look like, even if it's not what it actually looks like. On the opposite side of the bridge, a short walk away from the actual main garden, is what's known as the Column of Victory, 41 metre high stone column that stands at what's known as the Great Avenue to the park. It's a wonderful walking processional way throughout the main area. A lead statue of the first Duke stands at the very, very top, with Marlborough dressed yet again as a wonderful Roman style, as a Roman general. The original design was going to be done by Nicholas Hawksmoor, but the now widowed Sarah decided to use two men, Lord Herbert and Roger Morris, to complete the work. This impressive monument was begun in 1727, 5 years after the Duke's death, and was completed in 1730 at a cost of £3,000, roughly £250,000 today. The inscriptions on the three sides feature extracts from the Acts of Parliament that settled the estate on the first Duke and his descendants. And on the fourth side, Sarah had got Lord Bolingbroke to write a commemoration to the Grand Duke. Now, the final passage of Bolingbroke's works reads as follows: "These are the actions of the Duke of Marlborough, performed in the compass of a few years, sufficient to adorn the annals of ages. The admiration of other nations will be conveyed to latest posterity, in the histories even of the enemies of Britain. The sense which the British nation had of his transcendent merit has expressed in the most solemn, most effectual, most durable manner the Acts of Parliament, inscribed on this pillar, shall stand as long as the British name and language last, illustrious monuments of Marlborough's glory and of Britain's gratitude."